Great. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm just going to give another few seconds for people to join, for the slides to come up, and then we'll get cracking. Right, so maybe we can get started. So can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, to introduce myself, I'm Matthew Walsham. I work for the social protection team at FAO. I'm specifically focused in terms of my work around the links between social protection and climate action. I'm also co-chair of the Universal Social Protection 2030 Working Group on social protection and climate change, and that's really the kind of core group that's brought us all together for this session today, hosted by sp.org. So yeah, really delighted to be having this session. It's perfect timing, we felt, to have this at the start of the year, so that we can really build on and push on beyond the outcomes on social protection at COP30. And I think we were hoping for and expecting some pretty good outcomes for social protection last year under the Brazilian presidency. It was signaled very early on that social protection was going to be a kind of core element of the approach that the Brazilians were keen to push forward. And I think in the end, we can be pretty pleased with the sort of range of outcomes that we saw at COP, and it gives us a great foundation to build on. So the intention for today is to really take stock of that. So to have a look at what happened at COP30, in the run-up and at COP30 itself, in relation to social protection, to take a stock take on these kind of areas, and then to use that as a platform for thinking about how we work moving forward from here. And I think we can get this to when we get to the Q&A and discussion. But one of the kind of core priorities for us is to think about how we can push on from what we've got now, a kind of really interesting and helpful set of outcomes around social protection at the global level, and how we can push that now to country implementation work. How do we move from here to country level action? So that can be maybe part of our thinking for the discussion session towards the end. And I should say, yeah, like I said, this session is co-organised really through the Universal Social Protection 2030 Working Group on social protection and climate action and climate change, and then a set of partners under that group who've come together. So the FAO, ILO, Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre, UNICEF, the World Bank, and GIZ as all organising partners, and many of us are, there's also a kind of wider group of partners out there who've been very engaged in this. So I want to recognize it's not just that smaller group of partners, but a whole range of people who've been contributing to this agenda over the last, 12 plus months. And the second element of that would be not just the USP2030 working group, but also through things like the task force on adaptive social protection and climate financing that the BMZ set up, that brings social protection stakeholders together with climate finance actors as well. So I think that's enough background on why we've got the session. I want to move now just to talk a little bit about, to do some housekeeping, and then we'll move into how the session's going to be organised. So firstly, just to point out, the session's being recorded, and all the presentations and the recording of the session will be made available on socialprotection.org afterwards. There are automatic captions that you can access, sort of AI-generated ones, so look down there if you'd find that useful. Please do use the chat box to present yourself. I can see already in the webinar chat it's kind of quite lively. People are already sharing where they're coming from and what their expectations are. And then there's a Q&A box specifically. So if you've got questions for speakers, please do use the Q&A rather than the chat box to pose those questions. And it's a live Q&A, so there will be an opportunity if you prefer to say your question. We'll be able to put your mic on and put your video on. And we've got quite a lot, hopefully maybe around half an hour for Q&A at the end. So we're hoping for a very lively discussion. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and we've got some fantastic speakers, a group of people who've been involved really in the build up to COP30 and then also in the negotiations and in the kind of the event itself. So we've got Alexander Jaeger from the World Bank, Senior Specialist for Social Protection and Climate at the World Bank. Jana Bischler, Technical Officer for Social Protection and Climate Change at ILO, and along with Sayanti Sengupta, Senior Technical Advisor at Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre. They're both co-chairs of the USP2030 Working Group along with myself. And then we're delighted also that Luisa Silva Lisboa from the Ministry of Social Development and Assistance in Brazil is joining us, and she was really instrumental in many of the agendas that we're going to hear today. So it's fantastic that Luisa is also here with us to help us think through what happened at COP and then how we move forward from here. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so we've got this 5-minute introduction, and then we'll move straight into the presentations. We've got 3 presentations. So Luisa is going to start with a presentation on building on the Belém Declaration and how we mobilize action from COP30 to 2030. So thinking forward from here, she'll speak about the Belém Declaration on hunger, poverty, and human-centered climate action, which really has social protection at its heart, and also a bit about the action agenda. This is around the plan to accelerate solutions, and Luisa will give more details on this. Then we're going to have the presentation from Jana at ILO, which is about social protection outcomes in global climate negotiations. And she'll speak specifically about the kind of outcomes around the global goal on adaptation and the indicators there. And then also in terms of the Just Transition Work Programme and the mechanism that is going to be set up under that programme. And then third, our presentation is going to be a joint presentation on climate finance and social protection at COP30 from Sayanti Sengupta and Alex at the World Bank. And they're going to give a kind of overview of outcomes on climate finance as a whole, and then really dig down what does this mean for social protection with some specific reflections on the multilateral climate funds. And this is building on an output that was launched by this task force I mentioned at COP30 on social protection and the multilateral climate funds. So yeah, I mean, in some senses, we're a victim of our own success in that we've got a huge amount to cover in this session, and we're hoping to make, we're hoping the presentations are pitched for people who are, interested already in this and a little bit informed, but also for anybody who's kind of joining this space and for whom it's new. We'll hope to give us kind of balanced presentations so that you can catch up and then maybe, join what I think is a very productive and collaborative effort that so many stakeholders involved in the social protection world and the climate world have been kind of engaged in over the last year plus. Fantastic. So yeah, like I say, there should be 30 plus minutes for Q&A at the end. So really, please get your questions ready. And I think that's it from my side. So we're going to move straight into the first presentation. And I'm going to hand over to Luisa to take us from here.
Thank you, Matthew. Let me know once you can see my screen. Oh, can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you very much, Matthew, for the brief presentation, but also for the invitation to be here. I'm also very happy to see that we have a nice outcome. So a lot of people participating today, because I think that's also a little bit of a proof that the engagement that we and so many other partners have been working towards to mobilize people around social protection and climate change is working. So as Michael already said, I'm Luisa Lisboa. I am a policy officer here at the International Advisory of the Ministry of Social Development, Assistance, Family, and Fight Against Hunger of Brazil. And throughout the couple past years, I've also been supporting the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty as it transition away from the Brazilian G20 presidency in 2024 towards its own support mechanism. So today I'm going to cover a little bit about what is the Belém Declaration and how we got to here and what are the next steps that we want to follow in this next few months. So, wait, okay, I think it changed. So, first of all, I think that it's important for us to understand why we're talking about hunger, poverty, and climate. So, climate is a very cross-cutting theme. I think we all know that. But I think it's also very important for us to know and put in numbers and to understand the concrete impact that climate change has in exacerbating poverty and food insecurity across the world. So when we had the Brazilian G20 presidency, the Brazilian government launched two special task forces that pretty much just connected with the priorities and two of the main themes that Brazil wants to see in the international agenda that are the fight against hunger and poverty and also just strengthening multilateral governance around climate change and the environment. So the COP30 Belém Declaration was also a very good opportunity to, after the end of the Brazilian G20 presidency, to also come in and once again just join these two tracks and show to the world why it's so important for us to work climate with this view on the most vulnerable, on the people that are also suffering hunger and poverty and they're having their situations just worsen because of climate change. So just really quickly, here are some data and some numbers on how climate and hunger and poverty just exacerbate each other. They have this mutually reinforcing relationship where we have this estimate from the World Bank that over 130 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty by 2030 under an adverse climate scenario. At the same time, we have also here some numbers about the NDCs. So although we know that climate has this very perverse effect on the on hunger and poverty, until COP30, there was only this fraction of NDCs that had included concrete measures for the specific vulnerabilities and groups that are the most vulnerable to hunger and poverty, and specifically that mentioned social protection. So most of the countries did not have this until the third round of NDCs. This is something that has changed a little bit, but I think that my colleagues will be able to talk a little bit more about this. But that's also part of the context of things that we were trying to work and change when we're talking about the Belém, in the way towards the Belém Declaration. So a little bit on the path that we had to launch this declaration. So uh, first of all, I think there was a lot of technical work on trying to understand and show to decision makers and international organizations how the importance of just both integrating social protection into climate strategies, also the fight against hunger and poverty in general. So here we had three guidance notes that were launched from the end of 2024 until May 2025, where we would just be covering what are the actual solutions and the reasoning behind making this effort. So the first guidance note was from USP2030 and SPEAC-B working group. So it's pretty much we can say that it's one of the seeds that collaborated for the Belém Declaration. On the other hand, we also had this guidance note from the Task Force on Linking Adaptive Social Protection and Climate Financing for placing people at the center of NDCs 3.0. And on May, we had the guidance note on NDC for the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, where we would show some of the programs, some of the concrete solutions that we have in the Alliance's policy basket that could be included into NDCs and that could be implemented, where you could both have climate resilience and a reduction in hunger and poverty. So all of this was very important because while these technical discussions were being conducted in separate groups, at the end, everyone was just also seeing how COP30 could be an important moment for us to just link this and just put this theme in the center of the international political discussion. And I think that this also has a lot to do with Brazil's role, as I said, in both these areas of environment and social protection and fight against hunger and poverty. So at some point, we just joined efforts. So pretty much we had some meetings among the transition support team that was working from the Brazilian government towards the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty and the task force and USP teams, where we were just discussing how we could work towards a high-level declaration at COP30 and just joining efforts to make sure that we would have a very robust tax and political support to the declaration. So the first concrete and public step toward the declaration happened at the Seville conference for financing for development in July, where we launched this climate resilience, social protection, and smallholder agriculture finance partnership in the Seville platform for action. There we have quite a few, we have, I think, 5 actions on how on climate, social protection, and smallholder agriculture. But the first action is to work towards this leaders' declaration on hunger, poverty, and climate action. So on July, we started drafting this declaration with the support of USP2030 and the task force, but also within the Board of Champions of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. So we were working both on a technical side to have a strong tax, but also on these political side. So the countries would from the start already have some proximity to the tax because we knew that we had a very short amount of time. And then from October to November, we got the first endorsements to the text, and it was launched on November of 2025, sorry, it's 2026 in there, but I'll correct this. So the Belém Declaration pretty much is divided and drafted in this way. So we have 3 general areas of commitment that pretty much just highlight the ways and the areas where we want to work on hunger, poverty, and human-centered climate action. That is to make social protection a foundation of resilience, then support small-scale food producers as agents of resilience. And the third is enable just transitions for peoples in regions of forest and sensitive ecosystems. So, and then we have what I think that is very differential for the global for this Belém Declaration. That is, we bring up some clear means of implementation of how we can work in these three areas. That is to deliver scaled and equitable finance for human-centered climate action, integrating human-centered action into national strategies, and human-centered climate action in fragile situations and protracted crisis. And then we have this 7 quantifiable goals that the countries endorsing would work towards. So we have the expansion of social protection coverage, social protection climate readiness, climate finance for social protection, small-scale agriculture, climate finance, sustainable livelihoods for just transitions, and climate strategy and research. So these are the goals that we set up here. So pretty much trying to work on something that would be flexible enough to gather the political support needed for the declaration, but that would also put forward a very clear and quantifiable way. So at the moment, we have 49 endorsing countries for the declaration. So about the implementation and next steps. So after we launched the declaration, alongside it, we also launched a plan to accelerate solutions. So this plan to accelerate solutions is based on both the initiative launched at the Seville Platform for Action and also in the Belém Declaration. So pretty much we took the goals that we had in the Seville platform and the Belém Declaration, and we just translated these into 9 different outputs. And the idea for these different outputs, it's just that we can gather the support and commitments from the different actors. So we're talking about states, but we're also talking about international organizations. We're talking about MDBs and climate funds, and where we can gather concrete actions, either planned or new, that can support these outcomes and that will work towards the goals, the concrete goals that we have here at the Belém Declaration. So where are we right now? Pretty much we have everything that's ready, and now we just need to make sure that the Belém Declaration is not just a beautiful text that we have launched at COP30. So we're working right now, so the Brazilian government, but also the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty and the task force we're working together to see how these next steps are going to make sure that the declaration survives and delivers concrete results. So we're now working towards identifying and mobilizing partners to declare their plan or new actions under these 9 specific outputs, actually 8, because the first one was to deliver the declaration. And then also be able to accompany and report, accompany the progress under each of these outputs and continue to report it under the NASCA platform of UNFCCC. And a lot of this is linked to the 2030 agenda. So most of the goals we're aiming to have something delivered by them. But in general, I think that's the idea behind the declaration. I think I'm running out of time, so feel free to also put in any questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to try and answer them, or you can also contact me after this webinar, so we can understand how your organization can support the Belém Declaration. Here on the slides that will be shared by socialprotection.org, I have this linked, I have links to the publications that I mentioned, so the guidance notes and the Belém Declaration itself. And that's it. Obrigada. Thank you. I have here my contact information. As I said, feel free to reach out to me with any doubts or so we can understand how to support the Belém Declaration.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Louisa, for that excellent presentation. And yeah, I mean, obviously, really interesting to hear more about the Belém Declaration and what was embedded in there, and then also the associated action agenda. And yeah, I mean, the role also of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty in this process, alongside and partly overlapping with the Brazilian government during the interim secretariat sort of phase. And also the NDC, so the nationally determined contributions, which are individual countries' commitments to climate action for the next 5 years, or well, 10-year time frame, but renewed every 5 years, which was really an entry point for us as a group in terms of engaging with both the global and then country level agendas on how to link social protection and inclusive climate action. So it's great to hear you speak about that. And you were saying about the kind of improvements. I think an ILO review late last year found, before we were finding FAO and ILO a figure around 12, 13%, 13, 14% of NDCs included social protection. And in the new ones, it's above 60%, at least in November. So some really positive changes there. Also great to hear that more countries are signing up to the Belém Declaration. I think it was 43 countries in the EU at COP itself, and now 49 countries, you say. So there's the kind of action agenda coming out of this that you were talking about, but also that list of countries are countries who are signaling really a willingness and an interest to engage in this area. And I think for all those stakeholders on the call, it's worth reviewing that list and seeing if the countries that you work in are there, because it signals political interest to engage really in this agenda. And maybe for the Q&A at the end, we can come back a little bit to things around the action agenda, which is you've got the countries, the state actors within the negotiation processes, and then the action agenda for kind of non-state parties. And we, through USP 2030, are engaged in these processes that Louisa was describing. And again, people can reach out if they would like to learn more. But yeah, it's great to hear that the idea of the Belém Declaration as the kind of platform to then build on, so that we're seeing real action happening as we move forward. Okay, so I want to hand over now to say thank you, Louisa, and then hand over to Jana, who's going to give us a presentation on the outcomes really from the global climate negotiations at COP30, particularly around two core areas, I think, on the global goal on adaptation and just transition work program. Over to you, Jana.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, for the introduction. Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here. Thanks to Louisa also for the great presentation and for really showing how the Brazilian leadership and the COP presidency has really given a great push to social protection and in placing that quite high on the agenda. As Matthew said, I will now speak a little bit about the outcomes more of the formal negotiations. So as Matthew said, a lot of the action agenda and the activities that Louisa has spoken about were really sort of initiatives to drive more implementation. But this is sort of then, of course, underpinned by the broader framework that the negotiations are giving. And of course, this is sort of all countries then participating, and as you know, in general, the outcomes of climate negotiations are based on consensus, and so we can sort of see also how a broader group of countries sees social protection and what role it plays in terms of climate action. I hope you can all see my screen. Yes. Okay, so just a quick overview about what I will speak about today. I will start with just some general highlights from the COP30 decisions, and these are probably the highlights that lots of you will have seen in the news and in following some of the main points that came out of COP sort of independently of social protection. And then I will focus in on two key negotiation streams. One is the global goal on adaptation, and the other one, the just transition negotiations, because these are the ones that are really very relevant for us in the social protection community. And this is also where social protection is being discussed quite explicitly. For both of those, I will provide a bit of background, then a quick overview of the COP30 outcomes, and discuss also next steps, as this is, of course, important for us to think about how we can engage further. And I will end with some final reflections around global climate negotiations and social protection. So just some quick highlights from what was called the Global Mutirão package, which is sort of the main decision package that was in the end agreed in Belém. Some of the key things that were in that package was the decision to triple adaptation finance by 2035, and Alex and Sayanti later will speak a bit more in detail about climate finance, so I'm sure they will pick up on that as well. In terms of the global goal on adaptation, countries decided on a set of indicators to track adaptation progress, and this has been several years in the making. So this is quite a significant and important decision, and I'll talk about that in detail. There was also the decision to develop a just transition mechanism, again, something I'll pick up on in a second. We're also in a 2-year work program on climate finance currently to discuss how to reach at least the $1.3 trillion per year by 2035 that was decided at COP29 in Baku. So the sort of discussion or the issues really the countries are now grappling with is how are we going to reach this number that was decided. And again, I think Santi and Alex will talk more about that. And countries also decided on a gender action plan, again, something that has been many, many years in the making, which is a framework to integrate gender into national climate policies and plans. I think it's also important to consider what was not decided, and this has probably been one of the most sort of prominent things that was also a lot in the news. You may have heard about the discussions around a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels, which a large group of countries was calling for, but an equally large group of countries was opposed to that, so it did not make it into the final decision text, although the Brazilian COP presidency did initiate a voluntary process around that, and Colombia, together with the Netherlands, are hosting a first sort of voluntary discussion on this, I think in March it is. There's also been discussions in the 2 weeks at COP around draft language on fossil fuel subsidy reform, but equally a difficult topic that has not made it into the final decision because there was too much disagreement from many countries. And of course, as always, many countries were pushing for more ambitious targets and commitments on climate finance, but there has not been much movement away from what was decided at COP29 last year. So this is a little bit the overall framing, and I would like to now go into the 2 streams that I think are the most relevant for social protection, starting with the global goal on adaptation. And just to give a brief background on what that is, it is something that was established by Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. The objective of the global goal on adaptation is to drive adaptation policy action, financial support to reduce vulnerability, enhance resilience, and build adaptive capacities. It's taken a bit of time until countries have really decided and defined what do we mean by adaptation and what sorts of areas do we need to look at. I mean, on mitigation, it's something that's very clear. No, we need to reduce emissions. It's a very clear goal. While adaptation is a lot more multi-layered, and it obviously requires work across so many different sectors. So countries have taken a couple of years to really define what are the targets specifically around adaptation. And these targets were adopted at COP28 then in Dubai. And that was really one of the very big wins and very significant wins, I would say, for social protection at the time, because among the 7 thematic targets, and you can see them here on the right, they span across water supply and sanitation, food and agriculture, health, ecosystems and biodiversity, infrastructure and human settlements, cultural heritage, and then importantly, poverty eradication and livelihoods, where social protection is explicitly recognized as important for adaptation. And I have here in the middle the wording of that target 9F, which is substantially reducing the adverse impacts of climate change on poverty eradication and livelihoods, including through adaptive social protection measures for all. So this was a really important moment at COP28. And after Dubai, countries launched a 2-year work program that was to last between COP28 to COP30, which is basically in Brazil, in Belém, with the objective to develop globally relevant adaptation indicators that would help the world track collective progress towards climate resilience and the GGA, with the view to inform subsequent global stocktakes. And you have to think about it a little bit maybe as a sort of a parallel set of indicators to the mitigation indicators, right? On mitigation, it's quite clear what we want to track is whether we're reducing emissions. But what is it that we want to track on adaptation that can actually help us understand whether we collectively as the world are becoming more or less resilient? This is a little bit the question that this 2-year work program was trying to answer. Of course, taking very closely and working very closely along those targets that parties had decided on in COP28. So essentially, it was about finding and developing indicators for these targets. In this process, 78 experts were convened by UNFCCC, who collectively worked on developing a final list of 100 indicators that were submitted to the parties 3 months before COP30, and which were then essentially the basis for the negotiations at COP30 in Dubai. So the expectation and the hope was really that parties were going to adopt a set of indicators. And of course, what's important to understand is that all the COP30 decisions are very much party-driven, right? So it is countries that decide. In that instance, experts gave proposals to the countries, but in the end, it's countries that will decide what they will adopt and what they can accept given national circumstances and priorities. So in the end, what happened at COP is that parties adopted 59 of the 100 proposed indicators, but with some last-minute modifications that were made by the COP presidency in a bid to try and get parties to agree. Because what's important to understand is that during the 2 weeks of negotiations, there were a lot of divergences between parties in terms of their views of what indicators could be accepted and what indicators could not be accepted. Out of the 100, there were 2 indicators on social protection that we had proposed. And together with some colleagues from the ILO, we participated in the expert group to help work on these indicators. There were in total 9 indicators on poverty and livelihoods, and in the end, 3 of them were accepted, 2 of them being the 2 social protection indicators. So I think this is a really great win and success, I think, for us as a social protection community, because it really shows that despite a lot of disagreements on many topics, the 2 indicators that all parties could agree on were the indicators on social protection. And I have pasted both their adopted wording and their originally proposed wording here. And compared to some of the other indicators, there was very little change actually done to their wording. And it's just important to understand that the first indicator is about coverage. So in the end, the final wording was the population in climate vulnerable areas with access to social protection. And the second indicator is on the level to which social protection systems are adapted to respond to climate risks, which is recognized as a new indicator where methodologies still need to be developed. I also just pasted here a couple of news around it, and those of you who may have followed some of the negotiations will know that the closing plenary was quite dramatic in the sense that several countries made some last-minute bids for changing or still providing further detail of some of the decisions, and one of the decisions that many countries were not so happy with was these decisions on the global goal on adaptation and the indicators, precisely because of these last-minute modifications that were made to some of the wordings. However, they were adopted in the end, and this is the sort of final decision that we now have. And I think from the perspective of social protection, the outcome is actually quite good. What's going to happen next now? I think this is the big question, and the decision from COP30 gives us some sort of of an idea of what the next steps are likely to be. They call this the Belém Others vision on adaptation, which is essentially, again, meaning another 2 years of work that is needed and which will mostly focus on developing guidance for the operationalization of these indicators, which will require further technical work to improve metadata and methodologies by COP32 through the establishment of what they call in the decision a technical task force. It's not quite clear yet how exactly this will work, but we're likely to find out more in the coming months of what will be established there. The decision also calls on international organizations and agencies to support the technical work and to enhance the operationalization of the Belém adaptation indicator, including through methodology, standards, and metadata. So the recognition here is very much that many of these indicators are new and that they will require further work in order to make them operational. And of course, I think, what would be also very interesting is for us to discuss collectively what we can do as a community also to support the development and the further work around these indicators, including, of course, also through our joint work on the USP2030, the task force, the Global Alliance, and so on, as well as, of course, very importantly, through all of our collective work on the country level. Now, just turning quickly to the Just Transition Work Program, which is another separate sort of negotiation stream. Just Transition entered the UNFCCC discourse sort of in the mid-2010s through trade union advocacy and also on the basis of the ILO Just Transition guidelines that governments, workers, and employers that are members of the ILO have jointly developed in 2015. An early sort of win in that sense was the Paris Agreement preamble, recognized the imperatives of the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. However, the recognition of the preamble doesn't necessarily mean anything for implementation. So this is what has come now later, where COP27 established the Just Transition Work Program and mandating dialogues and knowledge sharing. So again, not a formal negotiation track, but then at COP28, parties agreed on the modalities and the thematic scope of just transition, which included workforce impact, social protection, skills, financing, inclusion, etc. And parties decided to confirm that just transition has a very broad scope. And I think that's quite important. And the decision basically tells us that just transition is for all workers and communities, all countries, all sectors, for mitigation and adaptation. We sometimes put just transition a little bit into this box of the energy transition, but all sort of decisions that have been taken at, COP after COP basically tell us that there's a very broad agreement across countries that it's really relevant for all sectors and that it's not just mitigation, but also adaptation. So what happened at COP30 around just transition? Again, you might have seen some of the news in the news that in general, especially among civil society, the negotiations around just transition at COP30 have been celebrated and declared a victory. And this is because they have actually managed to get into the decision an agreement to develop this just transition mechanism to enhance international cooperation, technical assistance, capacity building, and knowledge sharing. This is a victory because so far, a lot of the discourse around just transition under the UNFCCC has just been based on dialogues, but not so much action, right? So this is the first time that countries have actually agreed that we need to sort of move to implementation on this rather than just having dialogues that sort of like set the framework around what we mean by just transition. I think from a social protection perspective, it's really important that every single decision on just transition so far has recognized the importance of of social protection very, very explicitly. I also think it's very interesting to see how the idea of social protection has become much more comprehensive in the decisions over the years. So, for example, in this decision now, the importance of social protection systems, as well as a consideration of the informal and care economies, unemployed people, and future workers for ensuring just transitions has been recognized. And importantly, social protection has also been highlighted in the context of enhancing adaptation and climate resilience as part of just transition pathways. So again, really recognizing that we're not just talking about mitigation, energy transition here. But when we talk about just transition, it spans across all sectors, mitigation, adaptation, and that especially for the just transition and adaptation, social protection plays a really, really important role. So again, here in terms of quick steps, the sort of crux will be now in operationalizing this just transition mechanism. And this will have to be worked out in sort of subsequent negotiations exactly of how this is going to work. But what's being discussed is that it will likely be a platform to identify available technical, financial, and capacity building support, and a way to foster coordination and coherence across countries and actors, but that there are no new financing obligations attached to it, but that solutions should not exacerbate that burden of countries. So just to wrap up, some final reflections. I think overall, we can say that the recognition and attention to social protection in the context of climate negotiations has steadily grown since COP27. COP30 decisions have continued this trend. I think the survival of the 2 social protection indicators in the context of what has become quite a heavily scrutinized list of indicators for adaptation is a really important victory. We will now, of course, have to see how we can support methodology development and operationalization. And it would be really great to maybe even discuss a couple of ideas in this webinar or also beyond in subsequent meetings of our working group and the task force. And of course, we'd be really happy for anybody that's really interested in this to join us. And finally, on just transition, I think we've made a lot of progress in terms of the concept itself, and now I think we're hopefully in a good place to edge closer to better implementation around just transition. Thanks a lot, and I hope I stayed in time, Matthew. Just about, no?
Thanks very much, Jana. Just about, but I mean, you were covering a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
So
thanks.
Thanks so much for that. That's a fantastically helpful presentation, both to give the kind of general overview of what came out of COP and negotiations, but then digging down on those 2 areas. I think the evolution of the concept of just transition is a really important thing for us all collectively to get our heads around, the fact that it's now this broader encompassing concept, and now that it's going to be more institutionalized in terms of action going forwards. Yeah, as you say, it's a huge opportunity area for social protection. Whatever kind of angle you're coming in, I think now can be very well fitted under the just transition rubric. And then on the global goal on adaptation indicators, as you say, a massive win. Just to give some, very public credit to the role that Jana specifically played in those negotiations, really feeding in on that. And I think it's, it was a huge amount of effort. And I think the outcome for social protection, even if for many other actors, I suspect it was frustrating for us, I think it's going to be a big platform to build on moving forwards. And I can see already in the Q&A there's a question on the wording. So Jana, we'll be coming back to you for maybe a few more thoughts on the specific wording when we get to the Q&A at the end. Fantastic. So I'm now going to hand over to Shayanti and to Alex, who are going to speak more specifically to the climate finance agenda at COP30 and beyond. So over to you guys.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jana, for that presentation, as well as to Luisa. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Shayanti. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor with Social Protection and Climate Team at the Red Cross Climate Center. And today I'm presenting with Alex on the climate finance related outcomes from COP30. I hope you can see my screen okay, but I'll start and just let me know if anything's wrong.
It's fine. It's fine.
Great, thanks. But before diving right into it, we thought of just saying what climate finance constitutes. So climate finance could be grants, loans, equity, or any other instrument that specifically is for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage related activities. According to the Climate Policy Initiative, we have seen that global climate finance has picked up pace. In 2021 and 2023, we saw some good spikes. And in 2024, according to some of this initial data, we see that it, for the first time, exceeded $2 trillion. But this is far below and far less than what is estimated to be needed, which ranges between $7 to $9 trillion annually to stay on the 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. But despite of that discrepancy, and we have different numbers floating around, but what is clear is that the public climate finance, which is often in the form of grants or concessional loans that are going towards developing countries, this is around 50.6 billion USD in 2023. And most of this climate finance is actually still going towards mitigation. So this is also has been highlighted a little bit more, that there is role for social protection in adaptation and loss and damage in just transition. And I think there's the need to talk a little bit more on how social protection does these other roles, in addition to mitigation, where there has been enough focus in terms of climate finance. And there are different sources of climate finance, of course. At the international level, there is the public sector, which comprises of the UN climate funds, the UN agencies, direct donor support to developing countries. But then there is also the private sources from philanthropic organizations, multilateral institutions, companies. At the domestic level, this could look like private banks, national development banks, but also governments, which are putting forward money and revenue for doing climate adaptation and mitigation. And at the same time, there's this private sector, which can be enterprises, households, philanthropic organizations, or private charities at the national level. So there's a different mix of sources of climate finance when we talk about climate finance, and it's not just the climate funds. But of course, climate funds are something that is in focus. We have been talking about how it can feed into social protection, and this is where Alex will go a little bit into deep. But before that, what came out of COP, and here I'm focusing a little bit on COP29 as well, because that's where the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG, was set up, which said that the total climate finance that we need is 1.3 trillion US dollars annually by 2035. This needs to be both from public and private sources, and 50% of this needs to come from private sources. Now, this is very ambitious. We are yet to see that level of finance coming in from private sources because of many restrictions and challenges in terms of returns of investment in some of these interventions that we want to be doing. But nevertheless, this is the goal that has been agreed to. And in COP30, we also saw that the previous adaptation target, which was 40 billion US dollars, this was tripled to 120 billion US dollars. This is what is aimed to be raised per year by 2035 if we are to adequately support the adaptation needs. But there's also other numbers floating around, which says that there is a need of up to 400 billion annually for adaptation. So there was a lot of contention that this is not a goal that we can consider as a ceiling. This is rather just a floor that we have arrived at. But however, this goal, if realized, is expected to close some of these critical gaps around food and agricultural systems, around water, early warning systems, and this is where most of this adaptation finance is expected to go. And just one last point on this slide, there's this joint Baku to Belém climate finance roadmap, which is also presented at COP. And this also gives some of these options, outlining some of these key actions that countries should be taking in terms of implementing when they receive the climate finance. So this could look like incentives for private investments. It could look like country platforms, but then there is this implementation framework that has also been presented, which comes along. If the goal of adaptation finance is reached, then how do we implement at the country level? And now I would just hand over to Alex to tell us a little bit on the major finance pledges that we saw at COP30.
Great, thank you so much, Hayanti, and then pleasure to be here today. Just a little bit stepping back maybe and looking at the results and the outcomes on climate finance at COP30. If you went to the press and saw what's happening...
I seem to have lost you unless it's Mark.
I can hear you, Alex.
Good. Jana, you can hear me as well?
Yeah, I can hear you as well.
Great, thank you. So if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, you could get the impression that we saw interesting developments. On the one hand, we saw the Baku to Belém roadmap, the Council of the COP30 Council of Finance Ministers that was created. And on the bigger agendas, we made more formal progress. So what the kind of sentiment that I heard from Jana earlier resonates with a lot of people, that we didn't achieve too much concretely on those agendas, and that's quite right. We didn't see on those overarching horizontal agendas, we didn't see too much happening. However, the process is moving, and I think it's a little bit still up in the air, and we'll need to see how it gets grounded during the next COPs. But that needs to happen. On the other hand, something that we saw is that surprisingly, we saw new initiatives coming up, particularly around forests, which is very important, as we know, because we need forests as carbon sinks, and we know that they're getting smaller and smaller. So at the very opening day, the initiative pushed forward by the Brazilian government on the Tropical Forest Forever facility really was a breakthrough in the forest community, with significant pledges from Brazil, from Indonesia, from Germany, and others, which amount up to 6.5 billion. This forest facility forever, this Tropical Forest Forever facility, is an interesting construct, rather new, about our credit lines, and it aims to provide 125 billion USD in total. Let's see if we get there, because there's a 25 billion target for the public sector and the 100 billion target for the private sector. So it is something that is still in the making, but it was really breakthrough, particularly also for local communities and indigenous people, because it has a set target there. Similarly, the Congo Basin forest pledges were significant. Again, a forest area that is so important for our climate progress. It's actually the biggest CO2 sink in the world, bigger than the Amazon and Southeast East Asian forest. So that's really also progress on that side. However, on the other side, when we look at the climate funds, where we saw more movement in the last years, there wasn't happening so much. For the Adaptation Fund, we saw another 135 million of new pledges. For the Loss and Damage Fund, actually not very much. Most of the pledges happened before and around COP, not at COP. So we only stand at 870 million up to today. Fortunately, on the climate investment funds, we saw pledges for a new program, which is a RISE program on resilience. And I'll come back to that later. So we have the initial 100 million funding here, and then the negotiations for the JEF 9th replenishment cycle. That's something that is ongoing. We hope to see a bit more at COP30, but it might come this year until May. So that's a little bit of overview. On the big agendas, not too much movement, or more on the formal side, new things on forests, and then a bit more trickling on the fund side. Last but not least, I think what we saw at COP29 and also at COP30 is a focus on the development banks and the multilateral development banks, kind of as a safe haven, because there is still money floating around. However, keep in mind that not all the shareholders of the different banks are pushing climate. So we will see how that portfolio develops as well in the next years. Next slide. One thing that we as a community worked on and that we were very happy about is the work with the multilateral climate funds. We see an increased interest from the multilateral climate funds. So that is the GCF, the JEF, the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, and the Fund Responding for Loss and Damage. We see them having more and more interest in social protection. And that's something that was put forward also by the USP2030 Working Group and the BM Satellite Task Force on Linked and Adaptive Social Protection and Climate Financing. A little bit of a breakthrough was the launch of a joint guidance note. That is, you see that on the right side, the Scaling Social Protection for Climate Action guideline that kind of details out on the one hand for the climate funds what actually social protection all about in the climate space, and on the other hand, for the social protection community, how they can access climate funding, at least for the four bigger funds. So that is a very handy guideline. Hopefully, I'll post a link to that in a second. When we're talking about those climate funds, we really have to understand that when they're opening up to the SP community in a certain way. Their general objectives are very much aligned already with our targets, and they also have this country-by-country approach that is a bit of a challenge at the moment for us, but is in line with our approach on the NDAs. So this kind of thing goes together well, and they also have a lot of grants for enhancing the capacities for new topics. So that's all something that is going well, but there is still a bit of a challenge that we now need to get this momentum on the ground into the countries and into our ministries and communities. Next slide, please. When we briefly go through the different funds one by one, just to understand again, there are those five big climate funds. They all have a different mandate. They all have a bit different structures and processes. But in general, let's have a brief overview. So the Adaptation Fund, as the name says, it's all about adaptation. And the Adaptation Fund has provided already entry points for social protection programming in the past, with a focus on cash transfers and livelihood support. So it's all about adaptation. And those opportunities persist. Within the climate investment funds, the picture is a little bit different because the CIFs have focused more on just transition and energy transition in the past. Now they're opening this new ARISE program, which follows a pilot program on resilience building, the PPCR, that really provides new opportunities for social protection programming. And it's a program that will come up in the course of 2026. The Fund for Responding Loss and Damage is the newest fund targeted on loss and damage response. So this is really about shock response, responsive ASP, where we can be a very, very meaningful delivery channel for the governments. However, it's yet to be fully set up. The FRLD announced the start of the Barbados implementation mechanism at COP30. So the spending of the first 250 million is ongoing, and the countries are starting to get very active on that. Sayantis will say a little bit more on that in a second. The GEF has, as I said, its new GEF 9 funding round coming up that has a particular focus on social protection. So we are a focal topic now in the GEF 9 programming, which is great. It will really kick off formally mid of the year, but the preparations are ongoing already in the institutions and in the countries. So we'll see where this takes our sector. And last but not least, the GCF has the biggest fund, who's also doing adaptation and mitigation and a lot of things. The GCF is really ramping up the game in terms of capacity and studies these days. Super interested to see what's coming out of that in close collaboration with the FAO. So that was a brief overview. On the next slide, we could go a little bit into detail on what that means for adaptation, mitigation, justice, and loss and damage. Where are our entry points? Given the time, I'll just leave it there on the slide for you to take up later and hand over to Shayanti.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that's a good point or a segue, because here we were talking a little bit on like how social protection instruments can support different goals, right? Adaptation, mitigation, just transition, loss and damage. And in the context of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which is the new kid in the block, we thought of giving you an example how this could play out at the local level, at the national level, which is what we also want to do, move from COP30 and all that has happened to national country level implementation. So for FRLD, which has opened up the call for proposals in December 2025 and has the call for proposals going on until June 2025, The process looks a little bit like this. As a first step, the board recommends having FRLD focal points. This could already be the direct access entities. Most countries have these already selected, but it can also be a new ministry or a new department within a ministry. So from the social protection sector, if there is a lot of interest, this will be the first institutional entry point to get in touch if there is the need or there is an interest to submit a proposal to the FRLD to leverage social protection systems for some of these loss and damage reduction interventions. Then the next step would be some sort of political alignment to present the value add of social protection, how it can actually avert, minimize, or address the loss and damage that we are talking about. And this would be needed. This would mean that having a series of meetings with ministries of environment or Ministry of Climate Change, whoever is the responsible entity, but also with the social protection authorities at the national and subnational levels who do this last mile reaching and see if the systems are ready for shock response and not. And if not, how can we still align and use some of the components of the social protection systems to support in loss and damage. Then the Fund for Loss and Damage has a very clear template out on their website on what is the access modality. You can try to access the direct budget support. This is the first time a fund has actually opened up direct budget support, but this is still, as Alex mentioned, in the development phase. So how it will look, how much can go to the budget, how much what are the requirements and eligibility criteria. This is still developing as we speak. But then there is also the possibility to do direct access through the accredited entities, the multilateral development banks, or the ones who already have been accredited to Adaptation Fund, GCF, or GEF. So if the UN partners are already accredited and you have an ongoing relationship with the social protection agencies, this is also something that's getting explored in Cambodia, for example, with support from UNICEF, WFP, and GIZ colleagues, where they are trying to submit, or they are trying to look into how this could be something that social protection can be brought in for loss and damage with support from development partners. And then would be the setting up of partnerships, who submits, who is the implementing authorities. And this is where NGOs, Red Cross partners, or other implementing agencies who have that last mile reach can come together in the proposal and finalize some co-design activities that leverages social protection. And there is a lot of interest, or the Fund for Loss and Damage says that they would like to support activities that support reconstruction, recovery, displacement, things that actually minimize loss and damage for the future as well. So aligning that and having that language in your social protection related intervention that you include in the proposal would be important at that stage. And then if all of that fits together, then there's the submission by 15th of June. And that brings me to the last slide with some final thoughts on what organizations, UN partners, civil society actors could be doing. So having this narrative clear, how the global finance or global climate fund goals aligns with what local realities or what the local context needs, and making that clear would be important, because we would have to measure outcomes and things like that to present that social protection is the investment case. So for the climate funds, so this is something that we can do, but we can also support in actually preparing the countries and making them ready for having the risk vulnerability assessments in place, having the proposals written in a way that is technically sound. So there's also this kind of work that needs to happen. Apart from that, there is also the work around monitoring of climate relevant outcomes in periodically, so organizations can support in this kind of work. And finally, working on with social protection and improving triggers, improving anticipatory action windows, improving the social standard operating procedures to work with national systems instead of having any parallel humanitarian systems ongoing, while keeping equity and accountability and those kind of values in mind would be very critical as we try and apply for these climate funds and overall the climate finance portfolio. Thank you. I would stop there. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Jayanti. And thanks to you and to Alex for, again, a really sort of helpful overview of the big picture in terms of finance, and I guess, it's not a totally great picture when you're looking at the overall scale of finance coming in at the moment. But again, the range of entry points for social protection, especially when we look at the multilateral climate funds, but more generally, I think kind of really interesting. And, the Fund for Loss and Damage, for responding to loss and damage, is a great example of a new fund where I think there's a real opportunity for social protection to position itself as a delivery mechanism for that fund. So that was a really helpful entry point. And I think we gave all three speakers a pretty difficult task to cover rather a lot in quite a condensed format. So thanks very much to everybody. We've got I think about 15 minutes just over 15 minutes maybe for Q&A. I can't at the moment see any additional questions in the Q&A. Jana already answered Saskia's question around the kind of wording within the global goal on adaptation indicators. But please, if you do raise your hand or put a question into the Q&A box, we can call on you. So if anybody would like to either, frankly, raise a question, or if they would like to also make a reflection, then this is an opportunity for you to do so. So while I wait on this, unless I've missed a hand at the moment, I can't see. Oh, we've got a question coming in. So in fact, that was Sylvie Wabs, an FAO colleague, has asked us to make a link between the social protection work and the global climate, so the action agenda, essentially, which is something that Louisa was talking about at the start of in the first presentation, and was in fact the first point on my notepad to raise, to maybe just give us a little bit of a sense of how that is going to work going forward. At USP 2030, we were involved as within this activation group, developing the kind of action agenda in the run up to COP, with a big focus on COP itself. But now that we're moving forward from COP, what does that look like in practical terms, and how can we as USP 2030, but also more broadly the social protection community, engage in that agenda? So maybe to Louisa for that one, and then we've got another question on shock responsive social protection. The opportunities that climate financing is providing. And Lily Mahidin is asking about liquidity on demand and predictability. So maybe I'll get Shayanti or Alex to give your thoughts on that. And then I had a question for Jana, which was more around the Just Transition work program specifically. So for me, the global goal on adaptation indicators, I can sort of see that there's a process going forward, but in terms of engagement with the Just Transition work program and the development of the mechanism, where do you see the kind of entry points for our community being, given that the kind of, there's such obvious hooks for us to connect to? It would be really interesting to get your thoughts. So should we start off with that as a round of questions, and then we can go from there? So maybe to you, Louisa, first.
First, thank you, Matthew. So I think that on how we can just keep on moving after COP30. So for me, this is pretty much the whole goal of the Belém Declaration and this acceleration plan that we're putting forward. So what we want there is pretty much to say, okay, so we'll keep monitoring and just keep putting these very concrete actions under this plan to accelerate solution that support the Belém Declaration, so we can just continue acting and making sure that the declaration does not only continue in a political sense as a political declaration that was launched at COP30 and that ends up dying after it, as unfortunately so many other declarations happen, that they kind of disappear after their COP. So right now, we're still under the Brazilian COP presidency until November, and the Brazilian government will still continue to work on the action agenda that was launched at COP30. And this also means to continue working with these other, with not just these, but all the plans to accelerate solutions that were launched in there, including this one that is supporting the Belém Declaration. So I think that's a very concrete way, and I invite all the organizations that are here to reach out and see how they can and just get involved with this. So as Sylvie suggested, we have a very clear way moving forward. On the other hand, I think that there's also some internal work, as Matthew said, for us as part of this social protection community to do, I think, among our organizations and also with our partners. So I think that last year, something that was quite clear, it became quite clear to me, and also I think to some other colleagues, is that a lot of the times we have these bubbles inside of our own organizations. So for us to continue pushing this social protection agenda alongside these climate resilience and even the just transition discourse, we need to also break these bubbles inside our own organizations. So it's important for us that are just from our own social protection teams to reach out to the people that are on the climate teams, because they're usually the ones that are receiving these calls to action around COP, around climate. And a lot of the times they don't really know about these specific points that we do. So how we can just work together to make sure that the resources, the efforts that we're putting towards climate adaptation and resilience building, they're also connected to generating social protection. So I think that's an important point as well. And yeah, just on this, something that I've been saying is that we don't really need these when we're talking about climate finance, we don't really need specific finance just for social protection, and that is not just climate finance as well, because we can overlap this. So climate finance can be used for social protection, for development finance, and vice versa. So I think we're working with we're working with less and less resources, financial resources, when we're talking about international development. And it's very important for us to, once again, break these bubbles and make sure that we take the most of every dollar and find these co-benefits. So that's my answer. So engage with the Belém Declaration and talk to your climate colleagues.
And I think those are two very key messages. There's also, as you said, there's some work for us to do internally, I mean, as the community as a whole, but also through the USP2030 Working Group. So anybody who's on this call who is keen to engage in this space, please do reach out if you would like to work with us in how we engage with this. We're already involved in the action agenda. We can continue our engagement there. And I think that's a really important way to do it. And breaking down that bubble, I mean, that's one of the things with the NDC development that we were really keen to do, to speak to the climate community as much as we're speaking to our own social protection community. And I think as we move towards implementation of NDCs, and also, we've got some planned work maybe around national adaptation plans coming up as well, where we can also be doing that engagement at the country level as well as within our institutions. So thanks very much, Louisa. So Jana, over to you for maybe some reflections on the Just Transition Work Programme, and then if you had any other thoughts, then this is an opportunity.
Sure, thanks a lot. And yeah, thanks for the question, Matthew. It's a good one. And I think ultimately it will be, in the first instance, very important for us to watch very closely how this operationalization of this mechanism unfolds. So the next step is now, the next important moment, I think, will be the next SBs in Bonn, the sort of mini COP, halfway COP, where I think we will get a better idea of what countries or parties in general have in mind with this mechanism and what exactly it will do. However, I think what's quite clear already is that for sure it will be some sort of platform for knowledge sharing, for experience sharing, for collaboration across countries in terms of approaches for just transition that work. I might be mistaken, but it reminds me very much of the sort of setup of the WIM XCOM on loss and damage when they started that discussion as sort of a long time ago, when it was essentially, when the rhetoric was a bit, okay, we don't have new money to give for loss and damage, but we can give that. And that's when they set up the WIM XCOM. And what they have really done for loss and damage is that they really sort of pushed forward this whole concept of loss and damage. What does it mean concretely? What can countries do? Sort of this kind of knowledge broker platform, as well as a platform for connecting countries to technical assistance. And so I think we could certainly think about, from a social protection perspective, whether we want to suggest to input into this, right? I think we have collectively quite a lot of material and quite a lot of knowledge in terms of what can work for just transition, especially in terms of social protection. So this is where I see quite a concrete entry point for us. There will be, as always with these negotiations, the call for submissions. I think there will be, the next call for submissions will probably be around March, where different stakeholders, both parties and non-party delegates or sort of organizations, will have an opportunity to provide views on what such a just transition mechanism should look like and what it should do. This could, of course, be an opportunity for us to provide a view specific to social protection if that's what we wanted to do. But yeah, that's sort of the one of the main entry points that I see, and to really watch and see what this mechanism evolves into. If you're more interested in it, as I said, it's been a concept or an idea that was quite pushed by civil society, specifically by CAN, the Climate Action Network, with support from the trade unions, but also from the women and gender constituency. And then at Belém itself, the indigenous peoples constituency joined that movement as well. They called it the BAM, the Belém Action Mechanism. In the decision, in the end, it was called the Just Transition Mechanism, I think. But what they were advocating and sort of calling for the whole time during the COP is the BAM. So you might have seen like nice little stickers. There's a picture where they even put a BAM pin onto the Secretary General's jacket. So there was a lot of movement behind this by a lot of the constituencies, and they've sort of developed that idea I will try and find the document where they sort of developed the idea, what they would like it to look like. Of course, it will then there will be the reality of what does it actually look like. The EU made a sort of counter proposal. In the end, they sort of settled on this just transition mechanism. And I think different people have different ideas of what it should look like or what it will look like eventually. And then, as always, it will be a question and a matter of negotiation of where they land.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's super helpful. Some of the background and also some of the entry points. And I think, we will certainly be engaging in this going forward collectively. So again, if people are keen to engage through that process, then do reach out to be part of that. Thank God it wasn't called the BAM, because there's already the BIM under the loss and damage thing as well. We get the BIM and BAM. So it's bad enough, the terminology in this sector, but there we go. And I know, from FAO's perspective, for example, the just transition, the way in which it's evolved, it's now for us, going to be, I think, going forward, the kind of critical framing for our entire engagement in this area. I know for ILO, it has already been for a long time. And I'm sure, obviously the roots of this in civil society action as well means that kind of perspective has been built in. So I think it's a hugely important framework that we've got to work towards going forward. That's great. So look, we're moving towards the end. We've got to Shayanti now and Alex this question about in terms of shock responsive social protection specifically, but I also want to balance that with a point that Sylvie Wabbs also put in about, well, what about the need for not just the shock side, but also how you embed that within a framework which is adapting to shocks, but also sort of longer term adaptation needs. So I guess you can kind of see if you can respond to both sides of that question, and then from Sinead as well, a little bit about the kind of barriers so far in accessing climate finance for social protection, which is, one of the the driving reasons behind the development of the document that Alex was presenting. So maybe Shayanti and Alex, to you for your thoughts, and then I think we'll probably have to wrap up at the end of that.
Yeah, I think Alex is gone, so I'll try and consolidate all three into one answer. So the climate funds have not focused on shock response and social protection so far. It has been adaptation, mitigation, just transition. And now with the FRLD newly launched, this is the one that is talking about those losses and damages that happens due to these massive shocks. So I think with the FRLD, the liquidity of cash and having that pre-positioned or having that already pre-agreed that can be dispersed at a rapid scale, at a rapid speed, is something that we are first time seeing in a climate fund. So I think FRLD would be the one that you would go to for shock responsive social protection. Just to say, it needs to be complementary to humanitarian. It's not replacing humanitarian actions. And this is very clear in what FRLD wants to say or wants to fund, right? So humanitarian actors are still necessary and they would do their response mechanisms as well. But for recovery, for displacement, migration, those kinds of things that are not funded and often communities sit with that, this is where FRLD comes in. So that's one. Accessing climate finance has been difficult because of the complicated application processes, decoding what they want and putting it in climate outcomes language, right? Social protection, we measure for poverty, food insecurity, vulnerability, and so on, but not necessarily, okay, this kind of climate adaptation was done, as Jana was mentioning. We don't have agreed goals on adaptation that we can now say, oh, social protection does this. So I think there has been that barrier. Understanding the funds in itself, what they want to fund, but also how do we frame our social protection work into the language of that and say that these are the outcomes we can expect from social protection. So, but this work is happening. We are trying that at the global level with the task force, with the working group, with the publication. So just keep watching and joining us. And the final one on the climate sensitive social protection, I think there's lots of terminologies, right? I mean, we talk about adaptive social protection when we don't want to only talk about shock responsive social protection, but rather a more holistic, where social protection systems are strengthened, finance is improved, climate risk considerations are integrated. So I think the focus should be in, like you mentioned, Sylvie, that on strengthening the systems and incorporating climate risk considerations, climate risk scenarios, future possible scenarios of how climate would look like, and strengthening our systems for that, so that if it's a shock, you can still respond to it, but at the same time, keep adapting to the changes that climate change will throw at us. So I think, yes, we need to talk about the long-term risk scenarios as well, and not just the shock response of social protection. Over to you, Matt, to close the session.
Fantastic, Santi. That was an impressive response to 3 questions in a very condensed but rich form. Thanks very much for that. Impressive stuff. And yeah, I mean, just to sort of echo some of the messages you put in there, I know that, you know, some of those barriers that we identified is obviously the reason that we've all been working in these kind of collective ways to engage with the funds. Some of them are, you know, maybe a little bit further down the line. Our engagement with the GCF, I think, has been very positive, and we've seen a real shift over a couple of years now from their kind of first trying to understand the concept to now really commissioning their own work and trying to embed that into their programming going forwards. And I think other funds are definitely moving in that direction. And then the fund for responding to loss and damage is obviously a new beast entirely and has some very obvious entry points for social protection. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves, and I think a challenge for us to make sure that we're making as strong a case as possible. So I just want to finish the session by saying a huge thank you to our panelists and to all of the co-organisers who helped to get this session off the ground, as well as to sp.org, and to all the participants for joining and for all the excellent questions. And maybe I can see that there's a slide coming up asking for feedback on the session as a whole. So please do that. And then, yeah, really, again, just to reiterate this point that we've made several times through the seminar, that we're collectively involved in this engagement with USP2030 Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change. So reach out to any of us if you would like to be involved and engaged in those processes going forwards. And that, I think that this kind of collective engagement, whether it's through that working group, whether it's through the task force on adaptive social protection and climate financing, or the engagement of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty as well in this space, alongside the Brazilian government, we've got this kind of real momentum now. That hopefully the seminar has given a sense of how far we've come, and then all the opportunities that we've got, I think, to work on as we move into 2026. So if this sparks interest, whether it's for an individual country, for the organisation, for the brief that you're working on, do reach out, and we'll see how we can take this agenda forward from here. So to say a big thank you, and look forward to working with everyone on this agenda as we move forward.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for the facilitation as well. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have
Very
a good
nice job, Matt. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Matt.